The lights in the auditorium were bright, almost too bright. 12-year-old Daniel stood backstage, his heart beating so fast he could hear it in his ears. He wiped his sweaty palms on his pants for what felt like the 100th time. Through a small gap in the curtain, he could see hundreds of people filling the seats. Some were chatting with their neighbors. Others were checking their phones. A few were eating popcorn like they were at a movie theater. This was the biggest stage Daniel had ever seen. Back home in his small town, the community center where he practiced piano barely had 50 chairs. Here, the regional talent competition had pulled in what looked like 1,000 people, maybe more. The ceiling stretched up so high it made him dizzy to look at it. His grandmother sat somewhere in the back. Daniel couldn't see her from where he stood, but he knew she was there. She had woken up at 4 in the morning so they could catch the earliest bus. They'd traveled for 3 hours, switching buses twice just to get here. Grandma had packed rice balls for the journey and had held his hand the whole way, even though Daniel was almost 13 and felt a bit too old for hand-holding. The stage manager, a woman with a clipboard and a headset, gave him a quick look. "You're up next, sweetie," she said, not unkindly. Then she rushed off to deal with something else. Daniel's suit felt wrong. It had belonged to his older cousin, who had worn it to a wedding 5 years ago. The sleeves were too long, so Grandma had folded them up, but they kept coming undone. The pants were baggy and kept sliding down no matter how tight he pulled the belt. He'd seen the other contestants backstage. They wore fancy clothes that fit perfectly. Some had makeup artists fussing over them. One girl even had a whole team of people surrounding her. All Daniel had was his grandmother and a suit that didn't fit. And now, the host's voice boomed through the speakers. "Let's welcome our next performer, Daniel Chen." This was it. Daniel stepped through the curtain and walked onto the stage. The lights were even brighter than he'd imagined. He couldn't see most of the audience anymore, just dark shapes beyond the glare, but he could hear them. First came the whispers. Then a few scattered laughs. Someone said something he couldn't quite make out, but other people around them laughed too. Daniel's glasses, which were held together with tape on one side, had slipped down his nose. He pushed them back up and more laughter rippled through the crowd. His shoes squeaked on the polished stage floor as he walked toward the center. They were his school shoes, the only decent pair he owned. But they were a size too big because Grandma always bought shoes he could grow into. Each squeak brought another wave of giggles from somewhere in the audience. The host, a man in a sparkly jacket, smiled at Daniel, but it was the kind of smile adults give kids when they feel sorry for them. "Well, hello there. What's your name?" "Daniel," he said into the microphone, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "Speak up, buddy. The folks in the back can't hear you." "Daniel," he repeated louder this time, and his voice cracked halfway through. More laughter. "Great. And what are you going to perform for us today, Daniel?" Daniel swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. "I'm going to play piano, a piece by Chopin." There was a moment of silence, and then someone in the front rows actually snorted. A few people tried to hide their laughs behind their hands, but Daniel could see their shoulders shaking. Someone whispered loud enough for others to hear, "This ought to be interesting." The 3 judges sat at a long table in front of the stage. The woman on the left, who had gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, raised her eyebrows. The man in the middle leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms over his chest. The younger woman on the right at least tried to look encouraging, but even she seemed doubtful. Daniel had seen that look before. It was the same look his music teacher at school had given him when he said he wanted to enter this competition. "Are you sure, Daniel? These competitions can be very competitive. Maybe you should wait until next year." But Mr. Peterson, his real piano teacher, had told him he was ready. Mr. Peterson was old now, probably in his 70s, and his hands shook when he wasn't playing piano. But when his fingers touched the keys, the shaking stopped and magic happened. He'd been teaching Daniel for free for almost 2 years, ever since he'd found him playing chopsticks by ear on the community center's broken piano. "You have something special," Mr. Peterson always said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." But standing on this stage now, with people laughing at his too big suit and his taped-up glasses and his squeaky shoes, Daniel wondered if Mr. Peterson had been wrong. The walk to the piano felt like it took forever. His legs felt wobbly, like they might give out at any moment. The piano sat in the center of the stage, black and shiny and more beautiful than any instrument Daniel had ever seen. It was a grand piano, the kind he'd only seen in videos online, The community center piano had broken keys and made weird buzzing sounds. This one looked perfect. More whispers floated up from the audience. Daniel could feel everyone's eyes on him. Someone coughed. Someone else laughed again, trying to cover it with a cough but not really succeeding. He reached the piano bench and stood there for a moment just looking at it. His hands were still sweating. He wiped them on his pants again, leaving damp marks on the fabric. "Whenever you're ready," the host said, his voice suggesting that maybe Daniel should hurry up because the audience was getting restless. Daniel sat down on the bench. It was too low. He tried to adjust it, but his hands fumbled with the knob, and it made a loud scraping sound that echoed through the auditorium. More giggles. Someone said something that made their whole row laugh. The judge in the middle, the man with crossed arms, looked at his watch. Finally, Daniel got the bench to the right height. He placed his feet on the pedals even though his legs were almost too short to reach comfortably. He positioned his hands over the keys and they were shaking. He could see them trembling in the bright stage lights. In the back of the auditorium, his grandmother clutched her old purse in her lap. She was praying, her lips moving silently. She'd worked extra hours at the noodle shop, saving every spare coin for months just to afford the competition entry fee. She believed in Daniel. She'd always believed in him, even after they lost his mother 2 years ago. Especially after that. Daniel closed his eyes and took a deep breath, just like Mr. Peterson had taught him. "When you're nervous," his teacher had said, "breathe. The music is already inside you. You just have to let it out." Another laugh from somewhere in the middle rows. Someone whispered, "Poor kid." Daniel took another breath. Then another. The auditorium was growing impatient. He could feel it. The energy in the room was restless, almost mocking. They'd already decided what was going to happen. They'd already written the story in their heads. The awkward boy in the bad suit would hit a few wrong notes, and everyone would clap politely and he'd shuffle off stage, and they'd all forget about him before the next act even started. But they didn't know about the hours Daniel spent practicing every single day after school. They didn't know about Mr. Peterson's patient teaching, or about the calluses on Daniel's fingers from playing the same passages hundreds of times. They didn't know about his mother, and how music was the only thing that helped when the sadness felt too heavy to carry. They didn't know anything at all. Daniel opened his eyes. His hands steadied over the keys. The laughter in the audience started to fade, replaced by an expectant hush. Even the skeptical judge leaned forward slightly, ready to hear what would happen next. And then, Daniel began to play. The first note rang out clear and pure through the auditorium. It hung in the air for a moment, like a question waiting to be answered. Then came the second note and the third. Daniel's fingers moved across the keys with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a boy whose hands had been shaking just seconds before. The scattered conversations in the audience didn't stop right away. Someone was still whispering to their friend. A few people were checking their phones. But slowly, like a wave moving through water, the noise began to die down. Daniel kept his eyes closed. Mr. Peterson had told him to do that if he got nervous. "Don't think about the audience," his teacher had said. "Just think about the music. Let it tell the story it wants to tell." The opening phrase of the Chopin piece was delicate, almost fragile. Each note had to be played with just the right amount of weight. Too hard and it would sound harsh. Too soft and it would disappear. Daniel had practiced this part so many times that his fingers knew exactly where to go without him thinking about it. In the third row, a woman who had laughed when Daniel first walked on stage stopped mid-conversation. She turned her head toward the stage, her eyebrows drawing together in surprise. The sound coming from that piano wasn't what she'd expected. Not at all. The judge with the gray hair, the one who had raised her eyebrows earlier, sat up straighter in her chair. Her name was Mrs. Patterson, and she'd been a concert pianist for 30 years before retiring to teach and judge competitions. She'd heard thousands of young people play piano over the years. Most of them were technically good but emotionally empty. They played the right notes in the right order, but there was no soul in it. This was different. Daniel's hands moved through the piece like they were telling a story. The melody rose and fell, sometimes strong, sometimes barely a whisper. He wasn't just playing notes on a page. He was saying something, though no one could quite put into words what that something was. The man in the middle, Judge Harrison, uncrossed his arms. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the small boy at the piano. He'd been ready to be unimpressed. This competition had been going on for 3 hours already, and most of the acts had been forgettable. Singing, that was okay but not great. Dancing, that was enthusiastic but sloppy. A magic trick that everyone had seen before, but this was something else. More people in the audience stopped talking. The woman who'd been eating popcorn let the bag rest in her lap, forgotten. A teenage boy who'd been texting under his seat slowly lowered his phone. Even the stage crew, who'd seen countless performances and were usually bored by everything, stopped what they were doing to listen. The music built slowly, gaining confidence with each phrase. Daniel's posture had changed too. He no longer looked like a scared kid in an oversized suit. His back was straight, his shoulders relaxed. His whole body moved with the music, swaying slightly as his hands danced across the keys. In the back row, his grandmother had stopped praying. Her hands were still clasped together, but now they were pressed against her heart. Tears were already forming in her eyes. She knew this piece. Daniel had played it for her hundreds of times at home, on the old keyboard they kept in their tiny apartment. But hearing it here in this beautiful auditorium with its perfect acoustics was completely different. She thought about her daughter, Daniel's mother, who had loved music so much. She'd worked double shifts at the factory to pay for Daniel's first piano lessons back before she got sick. She'd always said Daniel had a gift, that his hands were made for making music. Everyone had thought she was just being a proud mother, seeing talent where there was only ordinary skill. But she'd been right. The piece moved into its second section, and the mood shifted. The gentle, questioning melody gave way to something more urgent. Daniel's fingers flew across the keys faster now, but every note was still crystal clear. There were no mistakes, no fumbles. He played like someone who'd been doing this their whole life. Mrs. Patterson, the judge, felt something tightening in her chest. She recognized what she was hearing. It wasn't just technical proficiency, though the boy certainly had that. It was musicality, real genuine musicality, the kind that couldn't be taught, only discovered, the kind that separated good pianists from great ones. A man in the front row, a music teacher from a nearby city, had stopped smiling. When Daniel first walked out, he'd chuckled along with everyone else. The boy had looked so out of place, so awkward, but now his face had gone serious. He was listening with the intensity of someone who understood exactly how difficult this piece was. Chopin wasn't easy. Even professional pianists found his work challenging. For a 12-year-old to play it like this, the whispers had completely stopped now. The entire auditorium had fallen into a silence so deep, you could hear the sound of the piano echoing off the back walls. Over 1,000 people, all holding their breath, all listening. Daniel played on, unaware of the change happening around him. In his mind, he wasn't in a competition at all. He was back in the community center with Mr. Peterson, who would sit beside him and tell stories while he practiced. Mr. Peterson had explained that every piece of music was really a conversation. The composer was trying to say something, and the pianist's job was to help those words come through. What is Chopin saying in this piece? Mr. Peterson had asked him once. Daniel had thought about it for a long time before answering. I think he's remembering something beautiful that's gone now. And it makes him sad, but happy too, because he got to have it at all. Mr. Peterson had smiled, his old eyes crinkling at the corners. Yes, he'd said softly. That's exactly right. Now as Daniel played, he poured all of that understanding into the music. Every note carried weight. Every pause meant something. The melody spoke of memory and loss, of beauty and pain, of holding on to something precious even as it slipped away. People in the audience were starting to feel it too, even if they couldn't explain what they were feeling. A woman in the middle section found tears rolling down her cheeks, and she wasn't quite sure why. A father squeezed his daughter's hand, suddenly grateful she was there beside him. An elderly couple in the balcony sat hand in hand, remembering their own lost loved ones, their own precious memories. The third judge, the younger woman named Jennifer, had goosebumps running up her arms. She was only 28 and had just started judging competitions last year. She'd been a piano prodigy herself as a child, winning awards and scholarships, but somewhere along the way she'd lost the love of it. Music had become about perfection, about winning, about impressing people. She'd forgotten why she'd fallen in love with piano in the first place. This boy was reminding her. Daniel's hands moved through a particularly complex passage, where the left hand and right hand seemed to be having a conversation with each other. One would ask a question and the other would answer. Back and forth they went, weaving together into something that was somehow greater than the sum of its parts. Judge Harrison realized his hands were gripping the edge of the table. When had that happened? He'd judged this competition for 5 years running, and nothing had ever moved him like this. He dealt with facts, with technique, with measurable skill. Emotion was secondary, something nice to have but not essential. But this emotion wasn't secondary. It was everything. The piece was building toward something now. Daniel could feel it coming. The part where the music swelled up like a wave, where everything he'd been saying came together into one powerful statement. His heart was beating fast again, but not from nervousness this time. From the pure joy of it. From the feeling of connection between his hands and the keys, between the music and his soul. The teenager who'd been texting earlier had set his phone down completely. He watched Daniel's hands moving across the keyboard, mesmerized. He'd never understood what his mom meant when she talked about music being important, about art mattering. It had always seemed boring to him, just noise. But this wasn't noise. This was something he could feel in his bones. The melody climbed higher and higher, growing in intensity. Daniel's whole body was involved now, leaning into the piano, pulling back, swaying with the rhythm. The too big suit didn't matter anymore. The taped glasses didn't matter. None of it mattered except the music. And then, at the peak of the phrase, right when it seemed like it couldn't get any more powerful, Daniel brought it back down. Gentle again, soft, like a whisper after a shout, like calm after a storm. The auditorium was completely silent except for the piano. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. 1,000 people sat frozen, afraid that any movement might break whatever spell had been cast over the room. Mrs. Patterson, the judge, felt a tear roll down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. The music continued to flow from Daniel's fingers like water from a spring. It seemed impossible that such powerful sound could come from such a small person. But there he was, completely lost in the moment, his face peaceful despite the complexity of what his hands were doing. What nobody in that auditorium knew was the real story behind this performance. They didn't know that 2 years ago, Daniel's world had fallen apart. His mother had been sick for 6 months before she passed away. During those final weeks, when she was too weak to leave her bed, Daniel would sit beside her and tell her about his day at school. She couldn't talk much anymore, but she would smile when he talked. One afternoon, she'd squeezed his hand weakly and whispered, "Play something for me." They didn't have a piano at home then. They barely had enough money for rent and medicine. But Daniel had hummed a melody he'd heard somewhere, making up the tune as he went along. His mother had closed her eyes and smiled, really smiled, for the first time in weeks. "Beautiful," she'd whispered. "You have magic in you." 3 days later, she was gone. After the funeral, Daniel had stopped talking much. His grandmother worried about him constantly. He'd go to school, come home, do his homework, and then just sit by the window staring at nothing. Teachers said he was dealing with grief. Friends tried to cheer him up. Nothing worked. Then one day, about a month after his mother died, he'd wandered into the community center. He'd heard piano music coming from inside and followed the sound. There was an old man playing on a beat-up piano in the corner of the recreation room. The man's hands moved across the keys with such grace that Daniel forgot to be sad for a moment. That old man was Mr. Peterson. When the music stopped, Mr. Peterson had noticed Daniel standing in the doorway. "You like piano?" he'd asked. Daniel had just nodded. "Come here, try it." Daniel had never touched a piano before, but when he sat down on that bench and Mr. Peterson showed him where middle C was, something inside him woke up. He pressed the key, and the sound it made felt like coming home. Mr. Peterson had been teaching him ever since. Free lessons 3 times a week, sometimes more. The old man never asked for money. "Your job is to practice," he'd say. "My job is to teach. That's the deal." Now on this stage, Daniel was playing the piece his mother had loved most. He'd heard it once on a recording at Mr. Peterson's house, and something about it reminded him of her. The way it was sad but also hopeful. The way it felt like saying goodbye and hello at the same time. He'd asked Mr. Peterson if he could learn it. "That's a very difficult piece," Mr. Peterson had said, looking at the sheet music with concern. "Even advanced students struggle with it." "Are you sure?" "I need to learn it," Daniel had said. Not wanted, needed. Mr. Peterson had understood. He always understood it took Daniel 6 months to master it. 6 months of practicing the same passages over and over until his fingers ached. 6 months of Mr. Peterson patiently correcting his technique, showing him how to bring out the emotion in each phrase. 6 months of pouring his grief and love and hope into those black and white keys. Back in the auditorium, the music reached the part that had taken Daniel the longest to learn. It was a section where the tempo changed suddenly, where the gentle melody transformed into something more passionate, almost desperate. His left hand played a steady rhythm while his right hand spun out a melody that climbed higher and higher. This was the part where most pianists made mistakes. The coordination required was intense, but Daniel's hands knew what to do. They'd played this section 1,000 times in the community center, with Mr. Peterson sitting beside him saying, "Again," but this time, more feeling. "Don't just play the notes. Tell me what they mean." The audience was completely under the spell now. People who had been checking their phones had forgotten they existed. The woman who'd been eating popcorn had tears streaming down her face, though she didn't know why. The music was reaching into places in their hearts they didn't know existed. Judge Harrison, the skeptical one in the middle, had given up trying to maintain his professional distance. He was openly crying now, not caring who saw. In all his years of judging competitions, in all the performances he'd witnessed, nothing had ever touched him like this. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly judge, was thinking about her own daughter. They'd had a fight 3 months ago over something stupid, and they hadn't spoken since. Pride had kept her from picking up the phone. But listening to this boy play, hearing the love and loss in every note, she suddenly realized how foolish she'd been. Life was too short. Her daughter was too precious. Tomorrow, she decided, right then and there, she would call her. The young judge, Jennifer, was remembering why she'd fallen in love with music in the first place. When she was 7 years old, before the competitions and the pressure and the expectations, she used to play piano just because it made her happy. Somewhere along the way, she'd lost that pure joy. But this boy had it. Despite his worn-out suit and his nervous start, he had that precious thing she'd been searching for. In the back row, Daniel's grandmother had her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She was praying and crying at the same time, thanking her daughter for giving them this gift, thanking Mr. Peterson for nurturing it, thanking whatever force in the universe had kept Daniel safe and brought him to this moment. The music teacher in the front row, the one who had laughed at first, felt ashamed of himself. He'd judged this child by his appearance, by his awkward walk and ill-fitting clothes. He'd forgotten the most important lesson of being a teacher. That talent doesn't care about what someone looks like or where they come from. He made a silent promise to never make that mistake again. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, sat in the audience next to her mother. She'd been begging for piano lessons for months, but her mother kept saying they couldn't afford it. Now, watching Daniel play, watching how his whole being came alive at that piano, the mother squeezed her daughter's hand. They would find a way. Whatever it took, they would find a way. That's what great art does. It doesn't just entertain. It changes people. It makes them see the world differently, makes them question their choices, makes them want to be better. Daniel played on, building toward the climax of the piece. This was the part that had made him cry the first time he'd played it all the way through. Mr. Peterson had just let him cry, understanding that sometimes music opens up feelings that need to come out. The melody soared now, filling every corner of the massive auditorium. Daniel's fingers flew across the keys with absolute confidence. He wasn't the nervous boy who'd walked on stage anymore. He was a musician, pure and simple, doing what he was born to do. The stage lights made the piano shine. The sound echoed off the high ceiling. And for those few minutes, nothing else in the world existed except the music and the story it was telling. Some people think music is just notes and rhythm, just sound waves traveling through air. But the people in that auditorium knew better now. Music was a language that spoke directly to the soul. It said things that words couldn't say. It connected strangers in a way nothing else could. A businessman in a suit who'd only come to the competition because his daughter was performing later sat transfixed. He'd been on his phone dealing with work emails right up until Daniel started playing. Now his phone sat forgotten in his lap. He was thinking about his own son, who'd wanted to learn guitar but who he'd discouraged because it wasn't practical. What had he been thinking? An elderly man in the balcony held his wife's hand. They'd been married for 52 years. The music reminded him of their wedding day, of the piano player who'd performed at their reception. He turned to his wife and saw tears on her cheeks. He squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back, and they shared a moment of perfect understanding without saying a word. Daniel's hands moved through the final complex section before the climax. This part had taken him 3 months to master. Mr. Peterson had broken it down into tiny pieces, making him practice just 4 measures at a time until they were perfect. Then 8 measures, then 16, building it up slowly, patiently, until Daniel could play the entire section without thinking. The melody was building, 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 toward the moment where everything came together, where all the themes that had been introduced earlier in the piece wove together into one powerful statement. Daniel could feel it coming. His heart raced with anticipation. The audience leaned forward in their seats without realizing it. Even people who knew nothing about music could feel that something important was about to happen. The tension in the room was thick enough to touch. Daniel's grandmother closed her eyes. She thought she could feel her daughter's presence, like she was there in the auditorium watching her son play. Maybe she was. Maybe love was strong enough to cross whatever boundary separated the living from the dead. Or maybe it was just a grandmother's hopeful imagination. Either way, she felt comforted. Mr. Peterson sat at home 80 miles away, wondering how Daniel was doing. He'd wanted to come, but his arthritis had been acting up, and the journey would have been too much. But he'd taught the boy everything he could. Now it was up to Daniel to show the world what he could do. The music swelled higher and higher. Daniel's whole body moved with it, rising slightly off the bench as his hands struck the keys with controlled power. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward. The silence lasted 3 heartbeats, then 4, then 5. Daniel opened his eyes slowly, like someone waking from a dream. For a moment he seemed confused about where he was. The bright lights, the massive auditorium, the piano beneath his hands. Then reality rushed back and he remembered. The competition, the performance, the people watching. He'd finished. The silence stretched on, and Daniel felt a flutter of panic in his chest. Had he messed up? Had he played it wrong? Maybe people were quiet because it was so bad they didn't know how to react. His hands started to shake again, and he gripped the edge of the piano bench. Then someone stood up. It was Mrs. Henderson, the music teacher in the front row. The one who'd laughed when he first walked out. She rose to her feet, her hands coming together in applause that started slow but quickly gained speed. The sound echoed through the silent auditorium like thunder. And then everyone else stood up. All at once, like a wave crashing onto shore, the entire audience rose to their feet. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It wasn't the kind of clapping people do because they're supposed to. This was something else. This was people expressing something they didn't have words for. The sound was deafening. Daniel sat frozen on the piano bench, his eyes wide behind his taped glasses. He'd never heard anything like this. Never felt anything like this. The applause washed over him, and with it came cheers and whistles and shouts. Someone in the balcony was yelling, "Bravo!" over and over. A group of teenagers near the middle were chanting his name. The gray-haired judge was on her feet, her hands raised above her head as she clapped. Tears ran down her face, but she was smiling wider than she'd smiled in years. Next to her, the middle judge, the skeptical one, stood with his hand over his heart, shaking his head in disbelief. His eyes were red, and he didn't even try to hide it. The young female judge was crying so hard she could barely see. She clapped until her palms hurt, and then she kept clapping. Daniel's grandmother stood in the back row, her hands clasped together in front of her face. She wasn't clapping. She was sobbing. Great heaving sobs that shook her small frame. The people around her were patting her shoulder, congratulating her. But she could barely hear them over the sound of her own relief and joy and pride. Robert, the elderly man who'd lost his wife, stood with tears streaming down his face. He was clapping harder than anyone around him, and he realized that for the first time in 6 months he felt something other than grief. He felt grateful. Grateful to be alive, grateful to have witnessed this, grateful that beauty could still surprise him. The teenage girl who'd texted her mom was standing and cheering, her phone clutched in her hand. Her mom had already texted back, "I love you too. Sweetheart. Always." The girl wiped her eyes and kept clapping, kept cheering for this boy she didn't know, but who'd somehow changed something in her heart. The music producer in the balcony was still recording on his phone, capturing the standing ovation. He'd been in the music industry for 20 years and had seen plenty of talented kids. But this was different. This was once-in-a-generation talent, maybe once in a lifetime. He was already planning his approach, already thinking about how to help this kid without scaring him away. On stage, Daniel finally stood up from the piano bench. His legs felt wobbly, like they might give out. He didn't know what to do. Should he bow, wave, say something? Mr. Peterson had never taught him what to do after a performance because they'd never talked about performances like this. He bowed awkwardly, and his glasses slipped down his nose again. He pushed them back up with one finger, and somehow that small gesture made the audience cheer even louder. They loved him. Not just his playing, but him. The awkward boy in the too big suit who'd turned their mockery into wonder. The host rushed back onto the stage, his sparkly jacket catching the lights. He had to wait for the applause to die down before he could speak, and it took a long time. Every time it seemed like people were finishing, someone would start clapping again and everyone else would join back in. Finally, the noise settled enough for the host to be heard. "Well," he said into his microphone, his voice thick with emotion. "I think we can all agree that was something special." The audience erupted again. The host laughed and wiped his own eyes. "Daniel, that was absolutely incredible. How long have you been playing piano?" Daniel leaned toward the microphone the host held out to him. "About 4 years," he said quietly. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. 4 years? That was impossible. People spent decades trying to play like that. "And who's your teacher?" the host asked. "Mr. Peterson," Daniel said, a little louder now. "He teaches me for free at the community center. He used to be a concert pianist, but now he's retired." The host nodded, impressed. "Well, Mr. Peterson must be very proud right now. Can you tell us why you chose this particular piece?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. The auditorium waited. "It was my mom's favorite," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She passed away 2 years ago. She loved Chopin." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the silence of anticipation. This was the silence of 1,000 hearts breaking and healing at the same time. People who'd been smiling found fresh tears on their cheeks. The judges looked at each other, understanding now why the performance had felt so deeply personal. "Thank you for sharing that with us, Daniel," the host said gently. "And thank you for sharing your incredible gift." "Let's hear it one more time for Daniel Chen." The applause started again, just as loud as before. Daniel bowed again, more confidently this time, and then walked off stage. His legs still felt shaky, but his heart felt full in a way it hadn't since his mother died. Music had always been his way of talking to her, but tonight he felt like she'd actually heard him. Backstage, the stage manager who'd rushed past him earlier was waiting. "That was beautiful, honey," she said, and her voice cracked. "Just beautiful." Other performers who were waiting for their turn were staring at him. Some looked intimidated. Others looked inspired. A girl about his age holding a violin gave him a thumbs up, and he smiled back. The judges' deliberation area was buzzing with activity. The 3 judges sat together, but they all knew this was a formality. They'd all marked their scorecards the same way. Perfect scores across the board. Technical merit, perfect. Artistic interpretation, perfect. Overall impression, perfect. "I've been judging for 15 years, the middle judge said, his voice still rough with emotion. "I've never given a perfect score. Never even come close. Neither have I," the gray-haired judge agreed. "Not in 30 years of judging. But that performance," she trailed off, shaking her head, "that was as close to perfection as I've ever heard." The young judge wiped her eyes again. "Did you know? About his mother?" "No," the gray-haired judge said softly. "But I could hear it in his playing. Every note carried that weight. That love and that loss." Back in the auditorium, the audience was still buzzing with excitement. People were talking to strangers, sharing their reactions, trying to put into words what they'd just experienced. Social media was already lighting up. People were posting videos they'd taken, tagging friends, telling everyone who'd listen about the boy who'd played piano like an angel. The music producer had already sent emails to his contacts. "You need to see this kid," he wrote. "Trust me on this one." Mrs. Henderson sat back down in her seat, but she couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's performance. On Monday, when she went back to teaching, she was going to be different. She was going to remember this feeling. She was going to remember that her job wasn't just about teaching notes, but about helping kids find this connection, this truth. Robert was still standing, still processing what he'd felt during the performance. He pulled out his phone and called his daughter. "I know it's late," he said when she answered, "but I just wanted to tell you I love you. And I'm sorry I've been so distant since your mother passed. I'm ready to come back now. I'm ready to live again." Daniel's grandmother made her way through the crowd toward the backstage area. People kept stopping her, congratulating her, asking about her grandson. She smiled and thanked them, but all she wanted was to hold Daniel, to tell him how proud his mother would be, how proud she was. When she finally found him sitting on a plastic chair backstage, she gathered him into her arms. He was almost as tall as her now, but he was still her little boy. "You were magnificent," she whispered into his hair. "Absolutely magnificent." Daniel hugged her back, and for the first time in 2 years, the grief he'd been carrying felt a little lighter. The music had carried some of it away. Not all of it. The love for his mother would always hurt a little, but now it hurt in a way that felt almost beautiful. 20 minutes later, Daniel stood backstage with his grandmother waiting for the final results. The other competitors had finished their performances, but everyone kept talking about the piano boy. The boy who'd made 1,000 people cry. The boy who'd turned mockery into magic. Daniel's hands were still shaking, but not from nerves anymore. From adrenaline. From the realization that something had changed inside him. He'd walked onto that stage feeling small and scared. Now he felt different. Not bigger exactly, just more himself. "Whatever happens," his grandmother said, squeezing his hand, "you've already won. You know that, right?" Daniel nodded. He did know. The judges' scores didn't matter as much as what he'd felt while playing. That connection to his mother. That feeling of turning pain into something beautiful. That was the real prize, but still. His heart raced when the host called all the finalists back to the stage. The auditorium was packed again. People who'd left after their favorite performers were done had heard about Daniel and rushed back. The balcony that had been half empty was now standing room only. The music producer was still there, his business card already tucked in his pocket, waiting for the right moment. Daniel lined up with the other 9 finalists. They all looked so polished, so professional. A girl in a sparkly dress who'd sung opera, a boy in a tuxedo who'd played violin, a dance troupe in matching costumes. They all had stage presence and confidence and costumes that fit. And then there was Daniel in his cousin's old suit with his taped glasses and squeaky shoes. But when he looked out at the audience, he saw people smiling at him, giving him thumbs up. One woman was holding up a sign she'd made during the intermission that said, "We love you, Daniel," with a heart drawn on it. The host milked the moment, building suspense. "Our judges had a very difficult decision tonight," he said, pacing across the stage. "We saw incredible talent. Dancers who defied gravity. Singers who could shatter glass. Musicians who've been training their entire lives." Daniel's grandmother watched from the wings, her hands clasped together. She'd never wanted anything as much as she wanted this for her grandson. Not for the prize money, though that would help. Not for the trophy, though it would look nice on their shelf. But because Daniel deserved to be seen. Deserved to be recognized. Deserved to know that his gift mattered. But there was one performance, the host continued, that was truly unforgettable. One performance that moved every single person in this room. The judges were unanimous in their decision. The gray-haired judge stood up from the judges' table. This wasn't standard procedure, but she didn't care. She needed to say this. The host looked surprised but handed her his microphone. "In 30 years of judging competitions," she said, her voice carrying across the auditorium, "I have never been so moved by a performance. I have never witnessed such maturity, such depth of emotion, such pure artistry from someone so young." She paused, her eyes finding Daniel in the lineup. "When I was young, I competed in many competitions. I won some. I lost some. But the victories I remember most aren't the ones where I got the highest score. They're the ones where I felt the music, where I connected with something bigger than myself." She turned to face the audience. "Tonight we all witnessed that kind of performance. The kind that reminds us why music exists, why it matters, why we need it in our lives." The audience burst into applause. The host had to wait for it to die down before continuing. So, without further delay, the host said, taking back the microphone, The winner of this year's regional talent competition, with a perfect score from all three judges, is Daniel Chen. The auditorium exploded. People jumped to their feet again, cheering and clapping and whistling. Daniel stood frozen, unable to process what he'd just heard. He'd won. He'd actually won. The other finalists were clapping too, genuine smiles on their faces. The opera singer hugged him. The violinist shook his hand. They'd all been touched by his performance too. They understood that what he'd done was special. Daniel walked forward in a daze. The host draped a medal around his neck and handed him a trophy that was almost too heavy to hold. Cameras flashed. People cheered. And through it all, Daniel kept thinking about his mother. How she'd believed in him when he first wanted to learn piano. How she'd encouraged him even when she was too sick to get out of bed. How she'd said, "You have music in your soul, Daniel." Don't ever lose that. He hadn't lost it. He'd found a way to share it with the world. His grandmother rushed onto the stage, tears streaming down her face. She wrapped him in a hug so tight he could barely breathe, but he didn't mind. They stood there together, holding each other, while the audience continued to applaud. "Your mother would be so proud," she whispered in his ear. So proud." "I know," Daniel whispered back. "I felt her there. While I was playing, I felt her." The host asked Daniel to say a few words, and the crowd quieted down. Daniel took the microphone with shaking hands. He'd never spoken to this many people before. Never had this many eyes on him. "Thank you," he said, his voice small at first, then stronger. "Thank you to everyone who listened. And thank you to Mr. Peterson, my teacher, who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And to my grandmother, who sacrificed so much to get me here." He paused, swallowing hard. "And to my mom, who's watching from somewhere. This is for you." The audience stood again, applauding not just for his performance but for his heart, for his humility, for the way he'd reminded them all of what really matters. After the ceremony ended, people swarmed Daniel. Local news reporters wanted interviews. Other parents wanted to know about Mr. Peterson. Kids wanted autographs. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. The music producer finally made his way through the crowd. "Daniel," he said, kneeling down to be at eye level. "My name is Andrew Chen. I work in the music industry, and I'd love to talk to you and your grandmother about some opportunities. Nothing you have to decide tonight, just a conversation." He handed his card to Daniel's grandmother, who looked at it with wide eyes. This was the kind of break people dreamed about. Mrs. Henderson found them too. "Daniel," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "I need to apologize. I laughed when you first came on stage. I judged you before I'd heard you play. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry." Daniel looked at her, this woman who doubted him, and he felt no anger, only understanding. "It's okay," he said. "Everyone judges sometimes. But music can change minds, right?" Mrs. Henderson nodded, wiping her eyes. Yes, it can. You taught me something important tonight. Thank you for that." Robert, the elderly man, waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. "Young man," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "I lost my wife 6 months ago. I came here tonight thinking nothing could touch me anymore, thinking I was done feeling anything good. But your music, it reminded me that beauty still exists, that life still has moments worth living for. Thank you for that gift." Daniel didn't know what to say, so he just hugged the old man. Robert hugged him back, and for a moment, they were just two people who understood loss, connected by music. As the auditorium slowly emptied, Daniel sat backstage with his grandmother, the trophy on his lap, the medal around his neck. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, but happier than he'd been in 2 years. "What happens now?" he asked his grandmother. She smiled and brushed his hair out of his eyes. Now we go home. We tell Mr. Peterson the good news. We think about Mr. Andrews' offer, and we keep doing what we've been doing, playing music, living life, honoring your mother by being happy. Can I still practice at the community center?" Daniel asked. "Even if there are other opportunities?" "Of course," she said. "That old piano is where you found yourself. No reason to leave it behind." They took the late bus home, Daniel's head resting on his grandmother's shoulder, the trophy safe in her lap. Through the window, the city lights blurred past. Daniel thought about everything that had happened. The laughter when he first walked out, the silence while he played, the standing ovation, the perfect score, the connections he'd made with strangers, but mostly he thought about his mother, about how music had helped him process her loss, about how turning pain into beauty was maybe the most important thing a person could do, about how she'd given him this gift, and he'd found a way to share it with the world. 3 months later, Daniel would play his first concert at a real concert hall. Thanks to Mr. Andrews' connections, Mr. Peterson would sit in the front row, tears streaming down his weathered face, watching his student bloom. The community center would get a new piano, donated by someone who'd seen Daniel's performance online. And Mrs. Henderson would change the way she taught, always remembering the boy who'd taught her not to judge. But none of that had happened yet. For now, Daniel was just a 12-year-old boy on a bus, wearing a too-big suit, holding a trophy, and feeling, for the first time since his mother died, like everything might actually be okay. The music had saved him, and in saving him it had touched countless others. That was the real magic. Not the perfect score or the standing ovation or the opportunities that would come, but the reminder that one person's courage to be vulnerable, to share their truth, to turn pain into beauty, could change the world, even if it was just one heart at a time.